Characteristics and characters. The Romantic period. Characteristics and characters. These notes come from a variety of sources, most of which I have forgotten. To those whose work I might inadvertently have used without crediting, I apologize. These notes are in no way intended for publication or other potentially profitable use. They are used only as educational support materials. First, let's get rid of confusion. Romanticism and romantic originally referred to imaginative medieval stories about the adventures of knights of the period. They were written in French, which is a derivation of the Old Roman language, Latin. Hence, Romance language. Stories thus written were called romances. Because these stories involved frequent amorous encounters between knights and their ladies, the language evolved such that we now commonly use the word in this more restricted sense. In the study of literature, however, the term romance refers to imaginative, often idealizing, fiction, the stories themselves, the romances. The Romantic period. The publication of Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads in 1798 marks the beginning of the Romantic period in English literature. The major figures of the period included William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, George Gordon Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats. The period's end is generally recognized as 1832, the year of the death of Sir Walter Scott and the passage of the first Reform Bill in Parliament. Characteristics of the Romantic period. The work of the 18th century classic period had been marked by perfection of form, by precision and polish. The reader expected the rhyming couplet, heroic couplet, predictable meter, usually iambic pentameter, narrow, often lightweight subject matter dealing with the upper classes, and an ample supply of satire. The Romantic period was more diverse. Characteristics of the Romantic period. The movement was influenced by developments on the continent, the German Sturm und Drang period, the French Revolution. Precursors in England include Robert Burns and Thomas Gray, poets frequently referred to as pre-Romantic. The main philosophical influence on the movement comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712–78. Characteristics of the Romantic period. The German notion of the protagonist as suffering individual, young genius rebelling against unjust authority, and of the ascendancy of nature influenced the English writers. Here we have the origin of the enthusiasm for nature and the strong individualism in rebellion against authority, two of the main characteristics of the Romantic period. The Sturm und Drang movement also rebelled against the state literary and professional establishments of German society. Characteristics of the Romantic period. With the pre-Romantics originates the idea that the simple, the ordinary, the common is also the stuff of poetry. From them, too, we get the use of simple language. The expression of the ordinary in terms of the extraordinary is a characteristic of the literature of the period. Thus Burns' Wee Mouse's Nest becomes as important as our own homes in the moment of our comprehension of the poet's relationship to nature. Characteristics of the Romantic period. Further characteristics include a trust in emotion and imagination more than in reason and judgment. The use of supernatural elements. A concern with the particular as opposed to the general or universal. A greater interest in the medieval than in the classical. A concern for ecological preservation. Activists for individual liberties, especially the rights of the downtrodden. Concurrent events: the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror. The ascension of Napoleon. European War. The Industrial Revolution. Enclosure, privatization of public communal property. The slave trade. Laissez-faire economic policy. An insane king, Geo III, until 1811, followed by an indulgent one, Geo IV, until 1820. The poets William Wordsworth, 1770–1850, from the Lake District. Educated at Cambridge, lived a time in France. Worked closely with Coleridge 1795 to 1810 when a quarrel caused a rift that lasted until 1828. Became Poet Laureate of England in 1843. Died in 1850. After his death, The Prelude is published, a work at whose center are the ideas of growth in memory, the mutability of experience. The poets William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850. Notable for a felicity of phrasing, a simplicity in diction and in subject matter. He is the high priest of nature and very often discusses nature in general terms, philosophizing in her lessons for himself and for mankind. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834, from Devonshire. Educated in London and at Cambridge, left without a degree. Worked closely with Wordsworth 1795 to 1810 when a quarrel caused a rift that lasted until 1828. In an effort to relieve the pain of rheumatism, Coleridge became addicted to opium. Joined such luminaries as Sidney, Dryden, and Johnson as one of the select few elite poet critics of English literature. Became the best public lecturer in England, with a reputation for eloquence and conversational ability. Died in 1834. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834, a master of atmosphere. In a few words can bring us to a world where it seems natural to speak of a woman wailing for her demon lover. An awareness of the blessedness of the natural order of things. The lyrical ballads. Greatest collaboration in all of English literature. The power of poetic imagination reveals itself in the balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities. Coleridge's comments in Bibliography Literaria affirm that the aims of their book, and of the Romantic movement, are not so much monolithic literary standards or rules as a tension between often opposing values. This idea leads naturally to Wordsworth's assertion that it is the poet's mind and craft working on real language that transforms such language into poetry. The lyrical ballads. Whereas Wordsworth's role in the book was the expression of the ordinary as extraordinary, Coleridge's was to explore the supernatural, or at least romantic, yet so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief, which constitutes poetic faith. The lyrical ballads. Tintern Abbey is a prime example of the intense love of nature evident in Romantic poetry. Wordsworth looks at rustic life because in that condition the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. The mind of the poet, or of the persona of the poem, is the ultimate subject for the poet. The lyrical ballads. In the preface Wordsworth gives us his definition of poetry. All good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Emotional experience is not enough, it must be contemplated and given shape by the mind and adapted to language before it can be called poetry. The lyrical ballads. Also in the preface, Wordsworth tells us that the language of the poet must be the real language of men. This is a direct challenge to the preceding age of reason, Pope, Swift, Johnson. Required readings Wordsworth Coleridge My heart leaps up. The world is too much with us p. 675 ph. Coleridge. The rhyme of the ancient mariner p. 686 ph. Required readings in ph. Timeline pages 612 to 13. Background, Romantic period pages 614 to 621. Changing language pages 622. Burns background pages 624 to 5. Blake background pages 638 to 9. Mary Shelley background pages 648 to 9. Wordsworth background pages 662 to 3. The collaboration pages 664 to 5. Early reviews of Wordsworth pages 681 to 2. Coleridge background pages 684 to 5. The Poets Part 2 George Gordon Lord Byron, 1788 to 1824. Born into an aristocratic family. Attended prestigious private schools and universities. Left England because of social pressure concerning his unconventional personal life. Was celebrated throughout Europe for his poems, especially Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. He died in exile in Greece, where he is celebrated as a revolutionary hero. The Poets Part 2 George Gordon Lord Byron, 1788 to 1824. Created the Byronic hero, a passionate, moody, restless character who has become bored with the world, is enduring the consequence of some sinful past, refuses to be constrained by society's mores, and whose daring life both sets him apart, and makes him attractive. Was influenced greatly by Dryden and Pope, and is more connected to the 18th century than most of his romantic contemporaries. In terms of poetics, he was frequently critical of the other romantics, except for Shelley. The Poets Part 2 Percy Bysshe Shelley, 1792 to 1822. Born into an aristocratic family. Attended prestigious private schools and universities. Left England because of social pressure concerning his unconventional personal life. His poetry was never popular in his lifetime and often misunderstood. Stylistic experimentation and complex philosophy were beyond the ability of many readers. He engaged in revolutionary activity and was active in workers' rights movements. He drowned off the coast of Italy in a boating accident. The Poets Part 2 Percy Bysshe Shelley, 1792 to 1822. His writing is the most passionate and intense of the Romantics, yet the most intellectual. His desire to push the language to extremes, to express the inexpressible, makes him also the most difficult of the Romantics to understand. Is remembered also for a brilliant essay on poetry, A Defense of Poetry, 1821. Matthew Arnold has said of Shelley that he was too sensitive to be a really great writer. He called him a beautiful and ineffectual angel, beating in the void his luminous wings in vain. Shelley was much admired by his fellow Romantics, considered by most to be a better intellect and a better artist than the others. Had he lived, he too might have produced far greater works than are left to us. The Poets Part 2 John Keats, 1795 to 1821. Youngest of the second generation of Romantic poets, and the first to die. He was a mere 24 years old when his poetic genius became evident with the body of work he produced between January and September of 1819. Almost all his greatest poems were written in this time period. Critics agree that his works are some of the greatest poems in the English language, and that, had he lived, he might have gone on to achieve the stature of a Shakespeare. Unfortunately, tuberculosis struck him in February of 1820 and he died in 1821. The Poets Part 2 John Keats, 1795 to 1821. Is able to embody the complexity and concreteness of experience. Unrivaled ability to appeal to the senses through language. Unlike the other Romantics, Keats sought to subordinate his own personality, and to focus on his subject in all its complexity. The capacity for forgetting oneself and the concentration on, or identification with, the subject of the poem is what Keats called negative capability.